Hello, folks. I'm Mark Stay. I'm an author and screenwriter, and a couple of months ago, I started a little forum for writers called The Green Room. We meet twice a month over Zoom. Writers send me questions in advance on the craft and business of being a writer. It's all very relaxed and fun and chatty, and there's a really good mix of writers. Some just starting out, others are published and established, and it's all very relaxed and cool and recorded exclusively for folks who support me over on Ko-fi. So here's a little taster from last week's session with a really good question on how to write believable and unpleasant antagonists. First question from Annika. How do you write a believable and unpleasant antagonist? I've tried looking at antagonists I like from other books, but I can't put my finger on why some get under my skin and some don't. Where do you begin? And Annika adds, I write high fantasy. There are no elves or dwarves, but I have magic and weird creatures. Now, this is a great question. It's a big question as well. So thank you very much for this, Annika. I really appreciate it. I'm going to take my time with this one because it is important. So as always, let's kick off with the definition. An antagonist is a person who actively opposes or is hostile to someone or something. Now, this means your antagonist isn't just a black cat villain who is evil for the sake of it. They have historical or psychological motivations for what they're doing. And that's a great place to start when creating a great antagonist. So let's have a look at, for example, Ray Bradbury's classic Fahrenheit 451, which is set in a world where books are banned and burned, and the antagonist is Captain Beatty. Now, he hates books for their contradictory facts and opinions and that they encourage dissent and unrest. But he's also well-read, which makes him a hypocrite. But he has a choice. He has made a choice to destroy outlaw books that might encourage people to think. So as far as Captain Beatty is concerned, he's providing a public service. And Montague, our hero who saves the books, is a renegade who must be stopped. So that's a good example of a complex antagonist there, I think. Antagonists are very often in positions of power. So you got Captain Beatty there. You got Uriah Heep in David Copperfield. You know, he becomes a secretary and a business partner to Mr. Wickfield, allowing him to deceive Mr. Wickfield. You look at mob bosses, corrupt officials, powerful businessmen. They all make for great antagonists because of their position of power they hold over others. And very often the antagonists are a dark shadow of the hero. So Moriarty is a match for Sherlock Holmes's wit and deduction, but he's chosen a life of crime. He is what Sherlock could become if he made a few wrong choices. The same comes for Luke and Darth Vader, Harry Voldemort, Batman and the Joker. They're all dark shadows of each other. So when you're trying to think of an antagonist for your story, create the right antagonist for your protagonist. So the antagonist's role in the story is to force your protagonist to change. They're going to torment your hero so much that they have to rise up and overcome them or be defeated. So if you think your story is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, the antagonist is the synthesis. They represent the opposite of what your hero believes to be true. And that's not to say the antagonist is always wrong. A good baddie will have their own agenda that might seem reasonable to others. So Shere Khan in the Jungle Book, it turns out he was spot on about men hunting tigers to extinction. Nurse Ratched in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, she's a care provider who maybe lets the power go to her head a little bit. Javert in Les Miserables, he has this slavish devotion to the law and righteousness which drives him to pursue Jean Valjean. And now each of these represents the antithesis to our hero. Mowgli wants the freedom of the jungle, but none of the responsibility. Now, he learns through his encounters with Shere Khan that freedom is hard won. McMurphy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he challenges institutional power in the form of Nurse Ratched, but he discovers that institutions can be more powerful than the individual. And Jean Valjean epitomizes how a man who has done something that society sees as wrong can be a good man, but Javert refuses to show any leniency. Now, with all of these, the stories would have been much shorter and less satisfying if the villains had just been a little bit reasonable. So you can imagine if Shere Khan had accompanied Mowgli to the human village instead of trying to kill him. Or what if Nurse Ratched had acknowledged her own tyranny and relaxed some of her rules? And what if Javert said, you know what, it's a loaf of bread, those kids were starving, I'm going to look the other way this time, But each of these villains refuse to bend. because they have power. So think about your villain's power. If a villain is too easily overcome, then it's going to be unsatisfying for the reader. If they're overpowered, and this happens a lot in science fiction and fantasy and superhero movies, the villains have too much power, then you might find yourself reaching for some kind of deus ex machina solution at the end. So I think what we learn from good villains is the most satisfying ends are those that are somehow the resolution of the theme. Now, not all villains, are a person, or your traditional antagonist. Not everybody needs to be Darth Vader, and there are other examples. So the villain could be a force of nature. It could be trapped in a storm or tormented by a shark. Look at Jaws. Robinson Crusoe was surrounded by an unforgiving sea. The world around your hero could represent the antithesis of who they are. Or it could be a rival or an opponent. So rather than just an out and out evil bad guy, your antagonist could be more of an irritant, a boss or co-worker, a strict parent, simply someone whose goals are in direct conflict with the protagonist. It could be a many-headed hydra. It doesn't mean to be just one person. If you look at Mean Girls, you got the alpha females there. Or most villains have henchmen who in some way embody an aspect of their ethos, and as the hero overcomes them, they learn something essential about the villain that will help them overcome them. Or it could be the protagonists themselves. They could be their own worst enemy, that the character's own failings and doubts can stop them from reaching their goal. If you think of Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye, or the narrator in Fight Club, Willy Loman in Death of a Salesman, he's delusional, insecure, volatile. So there are these other kinds. It doesn't have to be someone else. It could be any one of these things. And when it comes to writing and describing the villains in the prose, you can do a lot with a little. So, for example, Uriah Heep in David Copperfield, he's described as a cadaverous man, hardly any eyebrows and no eyelashes, eyes of a red brown. When we meet Annie Wilkes in Misery, who gets a really, really long description because she's one of only, it's a two-hander, really. The description is just fantastic. I'm going to read all this out, actually, because this is really good. It says, most of all, she gave him a disturbing sense of solidity, as if she might not have any blood vessels or even internal organs, as if she might only be solid Annie Wilkes from side to side and top to bottom. He felt more and more convinced that her eyes, which appeared to move, were actually just painted on, and they moved no more than the eyes of portraits which appear to follow you wherever you move in the room where they hang. It seemed to him that if he made the first two fingers of his hands into a V and attempted to poke them up her nostrils, they might go less than an eighth of an inch before encountering a solid, if slightly yielding, obstruction. So that's a description that dehumanizes Annie. It's broad and derogatory, but as the novel goes on, Paul Sheldon and the readers discover more and more about Annie and her motivations. And Misery is a masterclass in writing a villainous psychopath. It's brilliant. So you got Holmes and Moriarty. In the final problem, you really get the first description of Moriarty, where it tells you how brilliant he was. And another good one is Hannibal Lecter, who is I'll read this out as well, because in Red Dragon, which is the first Hannibal Lecter book, he's mentioned 29 times before we meet him, and he never leaves his cell, doesn't kill anyone for the duration of the narrative, yet he's the antagonist. And it says here, Dr. Hannibal Lecter lay on his cot asleep, his head propped on a pillow against the wall. Alexandre Dumas' Le Grand Dictionnaire de Cuisine was open on his chest. Graham had stared through the bars for about 5 seconds when Lecter opened his eyes and said, "That's the same atrocious aftershave you wore in court. I kept getting it for Christmas." Dr. Lecter's eyes are maroon, and they reflect the light redly in tiny points. Graham felt each hair bristle on his nape. He put his hand on the back of his neck. "Christmas, yes," Lecter said. "Did you get my card?" "I got it, thank you." Dr. Lecter's Christmas card had been forwarded from Graham from the FBI crime laboratory in Washington. He took it into the backyard, burned it, and washed his hands before touching Molly. So it's brilliant. There's more little details all the way through, and he's just in his cell alone, and it's so good that Harris basically repeats it for The Silence of the Lambs. So Annika, I hope that was helpful. That's a lot to take in. I appreciate it. Well, I hope you found that little taster helpful. The session's supposed to last half an hour. They've all gone on for an hour so far. I just love chatting to writers about this stuff, writers like you. So if you'd like to try it out, just pop over to my page on Ko-fi, whatever. There's a link below, and become a Green Room supporter. Until then, happy writing.